ready for the interview. In a few, get a cue live on the laptop. Watch what I'm gonna do. Welcome to the show. Let them know we got a point of view. Hey, yo, let's have a combo. Say what you feel, be real. That's the motto. Real talk pronto. Dr. D, PhD, hit an intro. Hold up, wait. Gotta be social. Network logo, a home for the local. Gotta be social. Network logo, a home for the local.
Alexander Hutchison here with us, and we're going to talk a lot about In Defense of Doping. Awesome book I just read, and I think a different perspective on this subject. Alexander, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
When I reached out to you, I thought I like to do episodes where we look at the other side of an issue intelligent, not for controversy, but for intelligent, for that. And you certainly are an intelligent person. And I want to talk about this book specifically before we really jump into it. Like, why this book? Why was this weighing on you to really get this book out to the public?
It was a long journey to get to where I am now, which I think is quite typical for anybody who had basically a change of mind and a change of heart on a particular topic. So I can start by telling you, like I did in the book, the evolution of my thought process as it went through. Initially, especially during the time when Lance Armstrong, who he figures prominently in my book, towards the end of his winning streak, I was quite suspicious of what it was that he was doing. And I was proven right when he finally admitted to the fact that he had been doping throughout his career. And at the time, I really wanted him to be punished quite heavily, not so much because of how that he doped, because I was quite confident just that everybody in his field was doing the same, but the way that he treated people in defending himself against accusations of doping. I thought that was pretty inhumane. And since that time, he has made amends with a lot of people. And as soon as he's done that, then you can't be any angrier than the person he's insulted, right? From that point forward, my thought process evolved a great deal based on a lot of the landmarks historically that were happening in sport at the time. Since that time, we've seen a lot about PTE in football. We've seen even more about the consequences of what happens in terms of if you take a bad fall in cycling. I could go on and on about the different injury issues. In addition to that, we see all the stuff happening with male in college, particularly football and basketball, and then the transfer portal. And in addition to that, you can look at, so most recently you had Jimbo Fisher, after signing a 10-year extension. 2 years into it, he gets canned, and Texas A&M has enough money that they can just write him a check for $76 million. And as a former college professor, I was like, this is such a remarkable waste of money. And it's just such a remarkably terrible message to be sending to who are supposed to be amateur athletes. And if any of those kids were to, prior to NIL, earn any money based on their name, image, or likeness, they would be stripped of their Heisman Trophy award or whatever the case may be. So you have this tremendous dichotomy in terms of how we treat the adults in the room versus how we treat the kids in the room when it comes to a lot of these issues. And finally, there were two more things that happened historically. The first being that we owned a gym for about 3 years. We opened and owned and ran a gym. And I started to do a lot of Olympic weightlifting competitions after we sold it in 2017. And I put together my application for a therapeutic use exemption because I've been on testosterone for the better part, a little over a decade. And that process took me 6 months just to get all the paperwork filled out. And then within 2 days, USADA rejected my application. And so when I asked, well, what do I do next? What's the process after this? So we have to go off your testosterone for 6 months. Then we have to test your blood to see that you're actually hypogenic. And then you can apply for your therapeutic use exemption. And I was like, you realize I'm just lifting age group. I'm just an old fart who wants to be in an organized competition. You don't have to give me a medal. You don't have to give me anything. I won't go to any other meets if I qualify for them. I just want to have a place to compete. Doesn't matter. If you get popped, you're going to be on our list and you're going to be banned for at least 2 years, probably 4. So that was another one of these things. Like, this is just absurd. Even technically speaking, if I were to go out and run a 5K this weekend that was certified by USA Track and Field, technically, since they're a WADA assignee, if they chose to test anybody at the 5K, which of course they wouldn't, but if they did and I popped positive for testosterone, I would then be banned. That part I find remarkably absurd. And then the last straw that finally just said, I'm writing this book. I've debated it long enough. I'm going to do it. Is when Sha'Carri Richardson after winning the 100-meter sprint at the 2021 Olympic trials. 2 days later, she popped positive for TH and she was penalized, call it suspended, for a long enough duration of time that it would prevent her from competing at the Olympics. And at that point, I was beside myself. That was just a criminal offense as far as I was concerned. Marijuana is not a performance-enhancing drug. Now, the position that WADA takes is that it is a drug of abuse. And so thus, since it's illegal in most countries, we're going to put all of these other types of drugs on the same list. And if you do these two, you're also going to be disqualified, just as if you were to take a performance-enhancing drug. But to back up that notion, well, they haven't been able to prove it because you can't really do the research on this. They do claim that THC is a performance-enhancing drug. Their theory is that they've heard anecdotally, particularly from NBA players, that when they smoke weed or eat weed prior to a game, it focuses them to the point where they're better playing than they would be otherwise. Extremely skeptical about it.
Very skeptical, me too.
And on top of that, you're not really gonna be able to test this because obviously at the federal level, marijuana is still illegal. You couldn't get a drug study funded in the United States to actually be able to do it. But if anybody has ever consumed marijuana in any mode or means, and then think about what it does to your body in that time, and think about what it would be like to then try to compete at your highest level at nationals or against your biggest rival. No way. There's no possible way. The reason for her taking the THC was perfectly understandable to me, and it was very human. She did not have a strong relationship with her birth mother. She was ambushed by a journalist who had found out that her birth mother had just died. She didn't know yet. So he asked her this question, what's your response to finding out that your mother is dead? Remarkably cruel, unjust thing to do. She felt a bit of anxiety, as I think anybody would under those circumstances. And she turned to marijuana to calm her nerves before the biggest race of her life. That's something that anybody would do. What WADA and USADA would have you do instead, probably have you take something like Xanax or a drug equivalent. That is the last thing on earth that I would want anybody to take before a big event. I would much rather that they ate a consumable or they smoked a small joints, whatever it was that they needed to get themselves back in front. What she did should not have been illegal. And that plays a big role in what I've read about in the book. But those were the series of events that finally led me down this path to sitting down and finally writing this book.
I have to tell you, I was riveted by it, especially because when I got the book, I read through the different chapters and stuff, and I like to skip around initially just to see. And on this topic, I skipped to the cannabis chapter. And by the way, great story about you and your wife, and you're taking the edibles and the whole. It was funny to me because I'm like, oh, that's me. I do that. Yeah, I enjoy that. And I thought to myself, when Sha'Carri Richardson got suspended, I blew up too. I was like, are you serious? Anybody that actually does this knows there's no chance that this helped her physiologically to run the type she ran. I don't even want to get out of my couch. I just want to like watch TV and eat some chips and stuff. So I thought, man, this rings so true. But then I'm reading about, I love the part about the hypocrisy of the spirit of the game. Mm-hmm. And now that's a big one for you. That's a big one. But on the other hand, like you mentioned with Jimbo Fisher and the Power 5 schools and the salaries, there's a huge disconnect. I would love for you to talk about that part, especially because that is so eye-opening, I think. The inequity and the money that creates such a disparity, and that's a performance enhancement, the money.
Sure. So in order for a drug to be put onto the banned list, it has to meet one of three criteria. The first one is that it basically produces an unlevel playing field. And there are some drugs that we know for sure do, in as much as they provide a tremendous enhancement of athletic performance. The top on my list is going to be erythropoietin, so EPO. So this is the same thing that all the cyclists were taking in the 90s and the aughts until they finally were able to get a sensitive enough test that they could ban a lot of that practice. Excuse me. Second one, so before I move on, with that, you have a short list of drugs that we know for sure provides some level of athletic, but the rest of them, unless they've been tested, you just don't know. So then they're doing their best guess, and they're saying, we suspect that this probably could have benefits athletically, so we're going to go ahead and ban it as well. The second part of this is athlete safety. And there is something to be said about that. We have cases in the past where people have taken performance-enhancing drugs and died during competition. But we've had athletes die during competition just from the nature of the sport itself. So that by itself, that it doesn't resonate very well with me, particularly when you're looking at a sport like cycling, when they're quite literally flying down Pyrenees, the Alps, 60, 80 miles an hour in rain. Until the early 90s, they didn't even require a helmet. And so the essence of that sport itself is remarkably dangerous. So is the drug that they're going to take more or less dangerous than the sport itself? It's hard to judge. You don't really know. But I understand the argument there at the very least. But then the last one is it violates the spirit of sport and fair competition. And that's the one that annoys the crap out of me, because it has to be any one of the three. So if it doesn't match the first two, then they always have this catch-all spirit of sport nonsense that they put in there. But the reality is that the rules that we establish for the games of the sport are what we're doing to try to make it a level playing field. Beyond just the rules of how to play that specific game, you have these external rules, which are all the stuff about doping. And that never existed until really the late 70s, really. And then within that, you can step back and say, are sports really fair per se? All by themselves are sports fair? And there's a long history where you can point out, no, of course they're not fair. There's lots of things that we do in terms of the nature of different games, who can compete, who has the money to compete, make it so that it's remarkably unfair. And so I looked specifically, and I talked into, particularly at the Division I level in college football and men's basketball in particular. Those are the big ones. If you look at the disparity in the amount of money that can be spent by a school on their athlete in terms of the things that they can purchase for them, the facilities that they can build for them, there's an enormous disconnect between, even in Division I level, 1A level. You still have, now we have a power 4 instead of 5 because the Pac-12 is dead. But eventually we're going to get to the point where we're going to have a separation between the power 4 and the group of 5 and run them to have two different groups, because they just can't keep up with the other. We can look at it beyond that on the international level. There's a number of examples that we can see where sports has been used to do what's called sports washing, which basically to distract the world from the horrible human rights record that you have in your own respective country by putting on these games. We've seen it in Russia. We've seen it in China. We saw it in Argentina in 1978 when they hosted the World Cup at the same time as they had a coup a few months prior to that. And they were actually imprisoning political prisoners in the stadium at the time when the World Cup organization came through to check the facilities. So we can go on and on about how sports used a weapon in a proxy war between political factions in different countries. So the thought that by itself sports are fair is not true. It's something that we strive toward, but in large part, in many instances, we still fail miserably to make sport fair for everybody.
Yeah, I thought that was so brilliant in the book. And it makes me think of when a team has essentially no salary cap and unlimited spending, the owners who have the most money are going to benefit from that because they can offer more than other ownerships that maybe not as wealthy for that. Having a salary cap in some ways trying to make it more even playing field. But when you have unlimited funds, it's no wonder when you post in the book, the salaries of different coaches, head conferences. Okay, clearly the people who can spend the most on the coaches, they're gonna win. When they face other conferences and stuff, their records are just like these crazy records, 202 and stuff like that. And versus when they play each other, more level, it's like more even for that. So it's never really been fair. It's always, you follow the money for it. But the drugs are the demonizing factor. And the substances are always the wave your hand at thing.
Sure.
You know?
But it comes, now there are athletes who are within the ranks who will do the wagging as well. And I'm not in any way judging those folks whatsoever. They have a stance that is different from mine, but I completely respect where they're coming from. It's when the judgment comes from people who have never competed in a sport in their life, or from ownership whose really primary interest is making money. And if anything gets in the way of that, then the athletes will be the first one that they chuck underneath the bus.
Yeah.
Historically, that's exactly what happened in 1998, when the summer of the home run record race, you had, was it 4 years prior to that, in 94, a lockout that canceled the World Series in 94. And that was the second time ever in the history of Major League Baseball that had happened. And obviously the fans were quite pissed off, and they didn't come back to the stadiums for a year or two after that. And what really started to bring them back was what happened in 1998. And so in this case, we have two athletes who are chasing the single season home run record, which is unusual to begin with. Usually it's only one. Or you might have a couple that will start off the season, then one falls off, and you have one that's going by himself at the end. In this case, you had a dead race down to almost the last day of the season. And you had two remarkably marketable, friendly, charismatic athletes who liked each other and were also playing in the same division, which is unusual. And they were also in the Midwest. It makes it really important in as much as they weren't on either one of the coasts where people could be a bit jaded about the sport. Maybe they show up after the game actually starts and leave early. That's not going to happen in St. Louis and Chicago, where these two teams were based, obviously. And then after you've gotten through all of this tremendous crescendo of all these positive feelings, that summer basically saved baseball. In 2005 and then again in 2007, they had congressional hearings after it came out steroids were indeed involved in baseball, and all of those good sentiments were just chucked underneath the bus. All the athletes were sacrificed, even though I'm absolutely convinced that ownership and management knew for sure that this was happening, and they said nothing because they wanted the sport to be safe. So they get what they want, and then as soon as they're done with what it is that they have consumed, they chuck them out a $2 hooker. Just a horrible sentiment to actually sit there and watch. Now, ostensibly, the reason for these hearings was because there were people who were concerned that children were going to start taking steroids. And that's a legitimate concern. It really is. But as I stated in the book, I have a 13-year-old daughter, and I am adamant that what she does in her life is my responsibility. It is not any one of her heroes' responsibility what she does with her life, even if they do it. If you look at the number of people, teenagers specifically, who have died specifically from steroid injection or steroid consumption, prior to those hearings versus the 15 years after, the numbers are the exact same. These things, you can't legislate behavior not very effectively, and you can't legislate morality very effectively. People are going to do what they want to do. And so in this case, when you derive some tremendous benefit in terms of the entire sport and the fan base from the actions of 3 or 4 individuals in terms of their choices to take testosterone or other steroids to make it so that they can perform better at their sport, you can't look on that all positive on one end, and then when you figure out what it is, when you figure out how the sausage was made, you just throw all the sausage away. That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me either. It was interesting, and I'm sure this, but I can't remember, is the NFL that they finally stopped the whole marijuana being a banned substance in the league? I can't remember if that's the whole thing.
They're on their way to doing that. And it's in my book as well. But the NBA is the one that's no longer going to be. The NFL's followed. NBA went first. NFL's following this next season that they're going to then do it. They will still test for it, but there will not be any suspensions or punishments associated with that unless it's on game day.
Right. But it's interesting how it was interesting how many players talk about in the past that they go into the locker room and they would get shot up with Toradol and all these different things to enhance them, to get them to be able to play. But that's okay, though. Weed, that if Le'Veon Bell and whoever else is in a car smoking weed before a game, that's so much worse than getting shot up with Toradol during the middle of a game. So you can actually go out and be the product and produce out there. Or that. The disconnect is mind-blowing. I always thought that. I was like, this is crazy.
Toradol in particular is a nasty one because it really puts a hell of a work on your kidneys and your liver.
Right.
And there's so many stories I could tell you about. I need to look them up to get the specific names, but of athletes who have either had a kidney transplant already because they wore out their kidneys with Toradol, or they're on the list waiting for either liver or kidneys because they took so much of that drug. Now, for those who don't know, effectively, it's an analgesic. So it reduces inflammation, it brings down pain, but it does it so well that you really can't feel anything. So you're injecting, and pain is not a nuisance. It's not something, we shouldn't think of it that way. Pain is a signal that they're physiologically to tell you something's wrong. And I'd really prefer you not continue to do this because you're going to make it worse. Or you could at least make it worse. So if you can't feel pain, either that's already there when you're going into a game, or worse still, you get an injury during the game with Toradol in your system and you can't feel that you've injured yourself and you make it worse by continuing to play. Talk about player safety. Give me a break. Beyond just domestically, I wrote about this in the book too. If you look 2 years ago when Rafael Nadal was at the French Open, he has a degenerative condition in his right foot where basically he's got a decrease in blood flow to one of the bones and it's slowly deteriorating over. It's in the arch of his. He's had surgery to shore up that foot, but from time to time he still gets a flare and it hurts like hell. So what he and his doctors decided to do was to numb him up with a Novocaine injection, basically for 2 weeks long, to keep his foot from hurting, but that meant his foot was numb. Now, you and I have both gotten Novocaine injections in our mouths to go through dental work. And then now, granted, those ones there may also be motor, so they actually impact how your cheeks work, but you can't feel anything. So do you really want an athlete like Nadal in particular on clay, which is the surface that you have to run, stop and slide on a foot where he can't even feel if it's present or not? I think that's a big issue in terms of player safety, but I'm also a libertarian as far as that's concerned. If that's what Rafael wants to do with his body, it's his business. And he won the damn tournament, so obviously he made a good decision as far as that was concerned. But if he did that same thing in a different sport, it would probably be banned in a different sport, because each sport has their own list of how they're going to do or what they're going to accept and what they're going to punish.
What do you make of this current time we're in where, especially in fitness and wellness, turning it towards that, where there's more open and outwardly admittance of taking steroids and just general recreational resistance training through like Instagram and all these different outlets? What's your thought process behind it? What do you think of that?
I've been on testosterone for a little over 10 years. And the reason I had to do that was because I had testicular cancer in '98.
Yeah.
So the remaining testicle that I had just didn't produce as much testosterone as we needed. And my wife and we just got married. So I had to go on hormone replacement therapy with HCG initially so that we could finally have a kid. That took 2 years. And then once that was done, I was quite content to switch to testosterone, because it was, instead of an injection every other day, it was just every week. And so I can talk about from a personal experience. That was in my mid-30s that I started that. So it's been almost 15 years. The amount of recovery that I need after a workout without testosterone is significantly longer than what I need with testosterone. It has allowed me to, I've gotten significantly bigger than I would have otherwise just by lifting weight and only doing physiological levels of testosterone. It doesn't surprise me in the least these things are coming forth, because I think after a while of being inundated with these messages of testosterone bad, you just get tired of listening to it.
Yeah.
And then eventually one of your friends who's been doing it and been keeping it secret gets tired of keeping it secret forever. And they say, yeah, to hell with this. I have been doing this. And I recommend it for you too, because you're always complaining about how you're always beat up and you can't work out anymore and you're feeling fat and you're feeling tired. Get some extra testosterone in your system. In terms of when we talk about health and wellness, there was the big wellness boom for about a decade there, where people were taking all sorts of crazy concoctions. Some of them are great, some of them not. The vast majority of them, I think, probably don't do a whole lot of anything except for make you some really expensive pee. But what you finally see, every one of those things that there people are taking in terms of the traditional Chinese medicine, these South American herbs, all of them by and large are in an attempt to regulate something in endocrinology, something in your endocrinology, whether it's going to be neurotransmitters, where it's going to be sex hormones, or it's going to be something else. So you're taking this additional step to try to boost your own endogenous production, and they really don't work. So instead of spending all this money on this, people just started going to aging clinics, is what they call them, or T clinic. But really all they're giving them is testosterone. Even for women, my wife, for a while there, was getting pellets put in her rear end about once every 4 months. And they made a huge difference in her sleep. They made a difference in her recovery from workouts, and obviously libido as well. So am I surprised that we have this glut of people who are coming through and getting to their age period now and saying, this isn't working for me. I need to get something. Not really. Along those lines, when it was poo-poo and people were really against, think of who that really was. That was my generation, Generation X, in our earlier years when we were a little more idealistic and our bodies were still working. And then as you get older, more and more of these stories and you're desensitized to them. And then you're not sleeping as well. You're putting on some additional pounds that you didn't used to before. You have kids that are driving you crazy. You need some kind of boost. The one thing that we mostly need, additional testosterone, both sexes. Okay. And so we finally get in touch with a couple of friends or we see something online and then eventually that thing spreads. And so now it's just the new normal. And that's part of what's driving this new idea about the enhanced games, for example. That wouldn't have happened 10 or 15 years ago. There's no way. But we have, as a culture, come to the point where we're like, is it really that big a deal? Right? So one more quick point let me throw in there. When we think of sports, what is sports in terms of what role does it play in our lives? It's entertainment. That is what sports is there for. It's not anything else. It's not, I mean, youth sports, basically we have full-grown adults who are playing children's games to make a living and making tons and tons of money off of it because we find it remarkably entertaining. Now, it's entertaining in a different way than is going to a rock concert or going to a movie. And as much as most of the time, you're emotionally invested in that team that is either representing your city or your school or your state or your country. Okay. And that vested interest can, at least initially, bring in some ideas of hurt feelings if you find out that somebody was cheating. But then when you really put it into context in terms of what happens across the entire field of play, most everybody else is doing similar things, if not the exact same thing as your hero. And then secondly, the way that I view it is that these people are doing whatever they can to give me the best product on the field, value for my money that I spent to come see them play.
It also makes me think, I'm sure you're aware of this. I think it was the Seoul Olympics, 1988, where they had done the survey of the athletes. What would you do to win a gold medal? Right. And then so many of the athletes, if it killed you, I can't remember the exact thing, don't quote me, but basically they would have an earlier death. And a majority of the athletes said, I will do whatever I need to do to win this gold medal, even if it means me dying early. And I thought that was a big snapshot into the mindset of how important winning is. And I think a lot of your book is, listen, I may not be condoning all of this, but I understand why. Athletes, that's the big part I took away is I understand why athletes are doing this. And that part, I think, is maybe the central theme of not the judgment, but the understanding of why this is happening. Like you even mentioned, have some empathy. You can talk about, and I didn't know this, that the earliest version of football, there were a lot of deaths in the game.
Tons.
That was wild to read, like how many guys died. There were people.
Yeah, and it was collegiate football. It wasn't even professional football. So you had people who were bringing in ringers that had nothing to do, no association with that college at all, just they could win a game. But the game itself was entirely different. There was no forward pass. So it was much more like rugby, but you would just smash into each other and move the ball 3 yards if you could and just keep doing it. And these teenagers and early 20-year-old people were dying right and left. And the sport was getting close to being banned outright because it was too dangerous. Until Teddy Roosevelt came in and formed a committee to figure out how they were going to regulate the sport and keep people from dying at such a regular clip. And that is really what then turned into the NCAA. But yeah, you're exactly right. And back to your point there of what people are willing to do to win. And this is something I didn't put in my book because I'd already made an argument. It's not just us who are doing it, not us, not just athletes who are doing it, it's everybody doing it.
Right.
Everybody takes performance enhancing drugs in some form or fashion, whether they want to admit it or not. The examples I gave were my college students when I was a college professor taking Adderall without a prescription. And then when I asked around to some of my friends, my full-grown adult friends were taking it as well, some of them with prescriptions, some without. And then when I read some more in terms of other professions that take performance enhancing drugs, the one that pops up, symphonic or symphony players. So survey amongst symphony players in the United States, it was like 7 years ago. And the question was specifically, have you ever taken or considered taking a performance enhancing drug, and which one specifically? 77% either admitted to taking they admitted to taking beta block. Okay, so a beta blocker works by basically slowing down your heart rate and making it so that it doesn't pump so hard. So obviously, if you're a symphony player, you have to work with your hands, you need them to be steady. You're going to take a beta blocker to slow down your hands and make it so you can be nice and calm and concentrate as you play. That's a performance enhancing drug. There's no way 77% of symphony players across the country have a prescription that's legitimate for beta blocker. No, bullshit. I don't believe it. Not for a second. Excuse my French. I shouldn't.
That's all good. Totally true. Everybody's trying to get an edge or an advantage in every single part of life. And now listen, the consequences of some of that are dire. You put that in the book about, hey, these certain substances, some of these are the nastiest ones. They cause some serious damage. But regardless of that, every human's looking for an edge. Always. Yeah.
Whether we take Cialis or Viagra so that we have an erection. You can go on and on about these. And eventually everybody's going to get to a point where they're going to need these. That's just the way it is. Would you rather just not have sex for the rest of life, or you want to take a performance enhancing drugs? I'm going to take a drug.
Yeah.
So I make that point specifically, but back to your point of what an athlete will do. Now, I was a pretty good athlete. I swam all the way through college, won 2 national titles, and I swam for a couple of years after that trying to make Olympic trials. But I am not at the same level as someone who's an Olympian. I'm not at the same level who's a professional athlete. Those folks are not like the rest of the general population. So when we see how could Lance Armstrong even consider taking all these drugs, considering he had testicular cancer, he's not like you. No, he's not. He's a different animal altogether. He's a psycho. And their threshold in terms of what's reasonable or unreasonable all revolves around, what do I have to do to win? Because losing is not reasonable.
Yeah.
And so you have to think about it in the mindset of an athlete like that, who wants to win at all costs, 1, and then 2, they've put their entire life into training for this thing, and their career is going to be over long before anybody else's career is over, because they can only play it for as long as their body holds out. They got to make all the money they can up front, because that spigot's going to get cut off anytime. And that's not the same reality that any one of us faces who lives in the regular world.
And so true. And I remember you mentioned about Lance, how like basically he came up in a very rough childhood and he was a mediocre hill climber essentially. And you knew he was doping because all of a sudden he was a dominant force. And I like how you described it in the book about, especially, and I'm going to hack this up a little bit, but like the initial stage where they release them every couple minutes or so and no one catches up to each other like that. And when he did, you knew, you were like, wait a minute, this is crazy. But in Lance's mind, he's basically, what else was he going to do? He basically didn't have a lot going for him outside of this, right? And this was his ticket, not condoning it, but like understanding the mindset.
Sure. Before he had cancer, he was doing the same doping that everybody else. He admitted to testosterone, growth hormone, cortisol. He would have taken insulin growth factor 1 and insulin, probably those 5, the big 5 and 7. He admitted to taking all those, but he had not as yet delved into EPO. EPO is a hormone that we make naturally in our body when we need additional red blood cells. So he was giving himself injections of this to artificially boost up his oxygen carrying capacity of his blood, which it makes athletes entirely different than they were before. So we always look at it in terms of a percentage, how much of an increase in performance do you get from this, that, or the next thing. EPO is about 10%. Now that doesn't sound like much, but think about the Tour de France 3-week race. Okay. From the winner all the way down to last place is probably going to be 2 or 3 hours difference in time. That is about the same. So 10% is about that distance in time from first place to dead buck naked last place in the Tour de France. Now, the last place athlete is not even trying to win. That's not their job. Their job is to support their team leader. So if you see that as being from the alpha down to the lowest of the betas, data athlete, 10% difference, that's what you get from taking EPO. That's the night and day difference. That makes it so that athlete who could never possibly win this event could. Now, I'm not saying Lance could not have won it without, but he was doing the exact same thing as everybody else when he finally decided to switch over and compete at the next level. You said, what choice did he have? He had the same choice that any one of us has. You can either do this drug and stay competitive, or you cannot, and then you're out because you're not going to get any sponsorship money. No one's going to pay you to be dead last place. No one cares. We all have that choice. Life is entirely predicated on choices that we make, and everybody has a choice. Even if someone's holding a gun to your head and they're going to kill you, you still have a choice in that moment in time as to what you're going to do. Go along with it or fight back. It's a crappy choice, but it's still a choice.
Yeah.
He had a crappy choice to make. He made the one he did. Honestly, if I were in the same position, I would have done the same damn thing.
Because I think he looked at it and thought, this other choice will lead me to irrelevancy. And humans don't want to be irrelevant. We want people to know that we exist and that we're important. And sports is one of the greatest elixirs or like temptations for that.
Sure.
You know, this seduction of being famous and fame and money. And you start the balancing scale, you start weighing that. And I like how you said this, Alexander, because I think sometimes, as I'm a former athlete, I'm in the fitness business, but I always tell people who consider themselves like, I'm athletes. I'm like, but you're not that version of athlete. There's a difference. I was a track and field athlete. I was pretty good, but I wasn't great. I had been around and I ran the pin relays and all these big meets. When you see Michael Johnson run up close, Maurice Green, right? You see these guys, Usain Bolt, that's not what instinctively. So you can't really identify with them because that's not even the same human being as you. And I wish people need to recognize the difference in that.
No, I think they do. It's hard to get people to understand that, be any person, because you got your own shit to deal with, right?
Yeah.
I'm not really worried about what Lance Armstrong is dealing with. I'm just doing what I'm dealing with, which is, that's fine. But before you make that final judgment as to the quality of that person's character, think about what you would do if you were going up against another person for a promotion and they had a little bit of a leg up on you, but you really needed to get that promotion to support your family because college is coming up or you have to pay for private school or whatever the case may be.
Right.
Are you really not going to take Adderall to stay up a little bit later to finish that presentation for your boss? Or are you going to go ahead and pop that pill you can provide for your family? Honestly, I think the vast majority of humans would do what they had to do to provide for their family. So when we talk about Lance, yeah, he didn't have a college education, barely had a high school education.
Right.
He's not trained to do anything else. Doesn't have any particular job skill. And so there's that worry of how am I going to support myself? But more importantly, if you're a bloodthirsty competitor like that, and it's not out of your system yet, you can't walk away from the game.
Yeah.
You just can't. Tom Brady nuked his whole marriage to come back and play one more crappy season and go seven and whatever with the Tampa Bay Bucks.
Roasted him about it.
That's not what I would do in my marriage, especially if I was married to Giselle, but a different guy. His brain works a different way. He was not ready yet. He's not done. And so I'm not suggesting by any stretch that Tom Brady is doing any kind of doping. I'm just talking about the mentality. It's something that most people cannot possibly relate to. You let your marriage go and your kids go because you want to play one more crappy season when you already have 7 rings.
Yeah.
He's not like you, buddy.
It's totally right. And one thing I wanted to mention too, I thought was, as someone who's used to training hard, and especially with track and field, it's a brutal sport to train for, is taking something doesn't mean it's the shortcut. You mentioned this in your book. I want you to expand upon, because I thought, man, as a former high-performing athlete, you train so much more than you compete. So much more. And training's painful, especially in sports where there's a lot of continuous training over and over again, interval training, that it just allows you to just train more. Like you train harder. Expand upon it, because I think that was a great point.
You hear it. People who are rather judgmental about doping, the first thing that they're not first thing, many of the times they'll say, it's just a shortcut. That's someone who really doesn't know what they're talking about. When we look at, and this is science, it's not just a personal judgment on my part. If you look at the best evidence we have for this, the East German regime, after the Berlin Wall fell, the West got access to the training logs, the doctor's logs, the pharmaceutical logs of what they were doing to their athletes. Now, I'm not in any way condoning what they did to their athletes. It was pretty horrifying. That said, the difference between them before taking what was called oral turinabol, it was just synthetic testosterone, and after was that they could log at least 10, maybe 15% more training volume on a regular basis. That's what made them faster. When you take a performance enhancing drug, you don't take it for the day of competition. It's useless then. You have to take it months prior to, in conjunction with your training. And what it allows you to do, twofold. One is that between your training sessions, you will require less time to recover so that you can do another training session more rapidly than you would be able to otherwise. During the time in your training sessions, when you're actually doing your recovery, you will get a bigger hypercompensation of your muscle mass in particular, the biggest thing we're looking for, but also your aerobic capacity than you would otherwise. So what the drugs are doing is they're allowing you to train harder and longer, and actually what I would call that is a long cut. They're making it so it's taking you easier for you to do more work. It's the exact opposite of a shortcut. And when people will talk about this, you don't know what they're talking about. They paint a picture of Lance Armstrong laying around on his couch with 2 beers in each hand and a bowl of popcorn on his belly while all of his friends are out training. And then he hops on his bike and he went to a farm. It's utter nonsense. But yes, there's that. So that is one thing that I think people should really understand. When we talk about being our best self or better self, this is something that I have to think about all the time. I want to know what my actual human limits are. And not just the ones that are genetically confined to me, but also those that I can get by enhancing myself. They're with better nutrition, better sleep, better coaching, better equipment, or with the addition of drugs. I don't see it as being any different at all.
I'm pretty similar to that. You think about, as I love track and field, you think about a certain athlete who may change from one coach to another because they want the edge. They think this is a better coach and they're going to have maybe a different training methodology, better idea of like how to structure the format of your season, the whole thing. That's a performance enhancement to me. The same thing. It's the nutrition. The athlete changes their nutritional approach that maybe is better, more optimal for them. They're trying to enhance their performance. It's a similar concept. I think we're very similar on it. That's why I saw your profile. I was like, this guy's right up my alley. Like, I'm not saying that I'm condoning all this, because I'm not. But I also think I totally get it though. I totally get it. Why? Because everybody's reaching for the edge, whatever that is.
That's right. It's no different in any other aspect of life. When I had my students who would come to our training sessions or tutorial sessions, before big tests, I would always give tutorials. As is almost always the case with these kinds of things, the only students who ever showed up were all my A students, right? None of my F and D students ever showed up. It was just like when I was a high school teacher, we'd have parent-teacher conferences. The only parents who would show up were the students who had A's. I don't need you here. It's great. Get out of here. Let me get the F here. But anyway, under those circumstances, we have a tutorial session. First thing that this kid does is pull out a pill bottle, shake it once. I'm not sure for what effect that was, and pop out a pill and just pop it in his mouth and take it. And I was like, what's that? It's Adderall. And he says, anybody else want one? I was like, what? Hand out your drugs in my classroom.
Yeah.
But after that experience, it was not a scientific study by any stretch, but I surveyed all of my classes and asked them anonymously, tell me whether or not you've taken Adderall or something equivalent to it. And I gave them the option to not participate at all if they want to answer the question. The vast majority of them took part in the survey, and it was a huge number of people who had done so. And again, it's because they're trying to get, that's an ed, trying to boost their own performance.
Yeah.
If they don't want to drift off and start thinking about their girlfriend or what they're going to do for the weekend in the middle of the test, and they take Adderall so they can stay focused. Whether that actually works or not, I'm not entirely sure, but that's what they're saying.
Yeah. As much as there's a huge emphasis now that I've seen, at least in my observation, this big wave of sleep's important. Duh. Yeah. We know sleep's important, but it's really come online in this last 15, 20 years with sleep research. And then people always ask, what's a great way I can recover so I could train better and stuff, sleep better? It's one of the greatest performance enhancers. It just outlines the point. Hey, this is a part of your performance enhancement, which is sleeping better. And if you can sleep better, you are giving yourself an advantage personally to boost your performance. So I always argue that it's literally everywhere. And the other thing I think of, if you're willing to train harder to get more volume in, first of all, that's painful. That's extremely painful to add more volume to your body. It's one of the things that's hardest for me as a 46-year-old is it's hard to get the volume that I used to have. Because I don't recover the way my compensation, it's not the same. When I was like 23, and I just rip off workouts daily, just left and right. That does not exist anymore. And it actually makes you feel like, at least for me, if I realize I'm human, because this is falling apart. And I think a lot of people realize that in all parts of their life, and they want to do something to change that.
And that's where this whole wellness industry cropped up, is be your best self. But for some reason, what we think of performance enhancing drugs as being cooked up by some monster in a laboratory, with beakers and Erlenmeyer flasks, and everything that's in the wellness industry is natural.
Right.
When the vast majority of the stuff that's there is an extract, which has been processed to death, has massive carbon footprint. I could go on and on about that, but it's the perception that we have of these two different things as being on opposite ends of the spectrum, really the thing.
Yeah.
They're just the same thing. This is designed to get you to make this stuff yourself. This is just giving it to you directly. Why cut out the middleman? If I don't want to have to eat, what's the stuff that people drink that's made with a brew of mushrooms? You know what I'm talking about?
Oh man, what's that? It's not kombucha, is it? You're talking about?
Oh, that's kombucha. Yeah. And I've had a couple of kombucha drinks that I thought were pretty good, but it was like, it was $4.50 a bottle. I don't know about $4.50 a bottle. But then I've had others. People like, I make my own kombucha. I'm like, okay. And you taste it, like, Lord.
Yeah,
nasty. Anything. But so I'm going back to the idea about sleep. And sleep is a big deal. It's probably one of the most important things you can do to help your body recover. But it's also in terms of like childhood development, teenage development. We see this massive epidemic of teenage depression, right? A large part of that because they spend entirely too much time on their screens, but the timing of which they do that is really the critical part. A lot of these kids are on their screens midnight, 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And just that act keeps them up even longer, sleep deprives them and makes them more depressed. One of the neurotransmitters that we need for sleep is melatonin. So what do we have now? We have parents who are giving their kid gummy melatonin to make it fall asleep and stop bothering them in the middle of the night. That seems really weird to me.
Very weird.
When my kid was, 4 or 5 and 6 years old, she had issues with sleep from time to time. We come into our room and we pop her in bed with us and sleep with us for that night. And then that's that. She would keep us up, roll all over the place.
Yeah.
So I get why parents don't want to have to do that, but you're going to give your kid a gummy that has melatonin in it, and you don't even know what the ramifications are of this down the road. But you're going to freak out if Lance Armstrong admitted taking EPO. Right. Where's there's a disconnect here that I'm not following at all.
Yeah, a huge disconnect. And also the basic thing would be to do it. I have a 12-year-old daughter, and she just got a phone. And every night before bedtime, she turns the phone into us so that she can have uninterrupted sleep. And I've told other parents, you don't do that. I said that one of the best ways to fix this is just not have the phone in their room. Do that. But then there's this other aspect of parents who are afraid of their kids' judgment of them. And I'm telling you, it's out there, Alex.
Oh, it's true.
I don't care about this. I'm not worried about that. But a lot of parents are so worried about their relationship with their kids on this level. Instead of being a good parent is difficult because it requires you to do things that sometimes are not popular to your child.
I think you're right in as much as I think it is difficult for a large swath of American parents.
I'm telling you.
I disagree with you that it's difficult in general, because it isn't difficult for me at all.
It's not difficult for me.
I don't give a shit. If my daughter is pissed off with me for something I came down on her for, that's my job, and that's the way it's going to be.
Correct.
And I believe you. I believe that you're probably the very same way.
I'm very similar.
I am not my kid's friend. I'm my kid's parent. When she turns 30 and I will then be in my 60s, then we can be friends. But until then, nah. I'm not interested in worrying for a second about what she thinks about me in the day.
Yeah.
Away.
That's my whole thing. I'm like, listen, I have a job to do. I love you. My thing's love and accountability for that. And I always tell my daughter, this is for your health and wellness, these things that we're doing. Your friends could have their phones in their room. That's their lifestyle, their parents. Here, we don't do that. And I don't really care what you think about it. I want you to have a very solid sleep schedule so that you'll be your best in the morning, which means that you won't be nasty toward me. Wait, a lot of parents do that. My kid has all these behavioral things. Do they sleep well? No. Why aren't they sleeping? Maybe you should not let them have their phone in their room. That generally, get the basics, and that generally helps to curb a lot of the issues that happen. It's not everything, but it's a big part of it.
It is. We're talking about kids. I frequently am asked, do you want your kid to take performance-enhancing drugs? Absolutely not. But my kid is a child, and I'm talking about full-grown adults. So there's a difference here right off the bat. One, just in terms of having consent. You don't have consent as a child because you're too stupid to understand these things, and you're going to hurt yourself. But in terms of how a brain develops over time, I don't want those drugs in my daughter's system as she's going through adolescence. Absolutely not. But we make children's sports different than adult sports. The rules are different. The fields of play are shorter. The goals are smaller. The protective equipment is mandatory and it's bigger. If you look at hockey, men's hockey, they require a helmet and a visor, no protection from the face whatsoever. And they wear the chin strap dangling down here, so it really doesn't do anything. But if you look at kids hockey, they're mandated to wear a full helmet with a face guard, and it has to be strapped tight. Different game, because we're trying to bring them along slowly, and we don't want them to have to face the same circumstances within the sport as we would put an adult through, because we want that to be safer. So straw man argument when people say, what would you do for your kid? She's an athlete. She's not taking anything. There's no way I'm going to let her take anything. But when she becomes a full-grown adult, that's going to be that's on the purview of my day anyway. I can give my recommendation, but she's going to do what she wants to do.
That's correct. Yeah, she once they become adult and they have an agency over their own decision making, you're essentially like, if you want my opinion, here's my opinion. And if you want my advice, I'm going to give you my advice. But in the end, you're going to do what you want to do anyways. At this point.
That should be the goal of every parent, to get your kid into a situation where they can do that.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of parenting, is to prepare your kids for the future when they make their own decisions.
Preparation. Parenting is preparation. And I think sometimes we forget that. I'm here to prepare my child to be a well-equipped adult, a good functioning member of society, a good contributor to society. And hopefully when she's an adult, your 20s, whatever, we can have a beer together and enjoy that. But that's not my role at this point. These things transform over time. And I've always understood that from the beginning. And I think that's why it's interesting someone asks you that, because you're like, wait a minute, why would I just have a blanket thing for kids and adults? That doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense.
They're very different things. Sure.
Yeah, completely different things. So I just thought this book was really illuminating. And I like the stance of, I understand why people do this. Because if it was like back in the day, I'm sure you remember this, when the WWF back then, when Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan, it was like this, they're taking steroids. It was like a big deal they were taking steroids. And now I don't think anybody would really care. They're taking steroids for wrestling.
That is entertainment squared, because the outcome is already predetermined. So it's not the same thing as sport, but it's still an athletic event. And athleticism that these people demonstrate, incredible. But what do you want to see when you go in to see a wrestling match? You want to see one or two guys that are big and flubby, like Andre the Giant or whatever, but you don't want everybody to be like, you want most of them to be cut, muscled, and look the part, and then pounding the living hell out of their body.
Literally.
So again, if you're going to do that for my entertainment, who the hell am I to tell you that what you're doing to recover between matches or to maintain your livelihood is something that's wrong?
Right.
I'm not interested in judging people on that level.
Yeah.
Because I know for damn sure, if I were in that same position, the likelihood is I would do the exact.
Yeah. Especially in something like that, where you see all these incidents of massive amount of injuries. It's not, it's predetermined, but these guys are really getting thrown on their back. They're jumping out of the ring. You try jumping out of a ring and landing on your feet, or barrel rolling or falling into a table. That hurts. Sure. You're going to feel some type of way about that.
And it's not like it's a niche event.
Yeah.
They're like, they have 10 followers. These are wildly popular. You go into your ESPN app and you scroll down to the very bottom. They have all the professional wrestling stuff, which at first I was like, what? It's on here. It's not even sport. Ridiculous. But then over time, I get it. That the birds of a feather. It's just the flip side of the same coin. It's a performance.
It's a performance. And even the other day I was laughing. I was watching, no lie, the Ocho on ESPN. They have that channel and they were doing like rock skipping. It was like a competition. I was dying. I was like, this guy had 50 skips. I was like, how do you do that? Somebody will be trying to enhance that too, man.
Sure. You have rock skipping. You have professional cornhole, which I've never been bored enough to sit there and watch professional cornhole. But the fact that it was on, I was like, I can't believe this is actually on TV.
Oh, yeah.
And then we have some other sports. We have these two, because we have YouTube TV. So all of a sudden, we had these two new sports channels that showed up. There were BN Sports. And they do more obscure stuff like highlight and sailing. And then they do some really cool triathlons. But these are sports that you tune in and you're like, I've seen highlight like when at the opening credits for Miami Vice.
Yeah.
But I've never actually watched the match. And I was like, that looks like Miami Vice. Yeah. Miami Vice. Okay. But sailing is cool to watch.
Yeah.
You're not going to convince me that all the rest of these sports are without their own drugs.
For sure. In fact, there's cornhole. What's funny is I know one of the announcers on ESPN from cornhole. Funny, as weird. And she tells me like the concentration factor leads people to take drugs that increase concentration. Right?
They're all on Adderall. Every one of them.
Everyone's going for a boost. It doesn't matter if you're playing chess, you're doing cornhole, whatever it is. It's a universal human feeling to like, oh, I get ahead.
Or even if you're not beating the competition, I want to know, how fast can I actually run?
Yeah.
This is how fast I could run without drugs. Now, I'm just sure. How fast can I run with drugs? It's still me. I'm just adding some booster rockets to myself.
Exactly. Alexander, this is fun. I really enjoyed talking about this stuff.
Yeah, I did too.
And what a great book. I highly recommend everyone else to check out this book. It's an easy read. It's a fun read. And Alexander makes a lot of great points on here that I think will resonate, especially if you're a big sports fan like you are, I am, and you've ever been an athlete. You'll have a soft spot for this because you'll understand when you train hard, the thought crosses your mind. So I appreciate your time. Please let everyone know other ways they can connect with you outside of this conversation.
Sure. So my website is goodegg.fitness. Good egg is one word. And you can reach me at alexander@goodegg.fitness. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me on LinkedIn. I've got my other 3 books on Amazon as well. So the first one is Exercise Ain't Enough. And that's about how, if you're interested in losing weight, diet always trumps exercise.
Always.
The second one is called The Swim Prescription, where I talk about all the different ways that swimming is better than land-based exercise. And of course, my most recent release is In Defense of Doping.
Thank you, Alexander. I appreciate your time. And I look forward to getting this out there. Thank you.
Great. I hope we get to speak again soon, buddy.